In the year 930, an event occurred the Muslim world tried to forget. A man with an iron sledgehammer approached the Kaaba and shattered the black stone, a fragment of paradise. He didn't just destroy it, he stole it and, for 22 years, treated Islam's holiest relic as a footstool in a latrine. This is the story of a sect that slaughtered tens of thousands of pilgrims and defiled God's house in silence. In the year 930, the holy city of Mecca was gasping for breath under the oppressive weight of the sun. The heat pressed down on the valley like a heavy wool blanket, stifling the air. Thousands of pilgrims had flooded the narrow streets, drawn from every corner of the known world. They moved in a mesmerizing, continuous river of white cloth. They circled the Kaaba like moths drawn to the only candle in a dark universe. They were confident that in this sacred place, they were untouchable. It was a sanctuary where tearing a leaf from a tree was considered a sin. The pilgrims believed they stood in the safest place on earth, protected by the Almighty. They had shed their worldly identities and donned the white robes of Ihram. The air vibrated with the low, hypnotic hum of thousands of voices whispering prayers. But the horizon suddenly began to darken, not with the shadow of a passing cloud. It was not the precursor to a desert sandstorm that blocked the light. A wall of dust was rising from the hooves of 1,000 horses. They were riding hard toward the gates of the sanctuary with terrifying speed. These riders did not carry rosaries or water skins for the journey. They carried naked steel that glinted cruelly in the midday sun. They did not whisper verses of peace or humility to the heavens. They screamed curses that froze the blood of the faithful in their veins. The Carmatians had arrived from the salt flats of Bahrain. They were a fanatic sect that viewed the pilgrimage as nothing more than idol worship. To them, the Kaaba was not a holy house but a pagan shrine. They burst into the city with the force of a sudden tidal wave. The transition from peace to absolute slaughter was instantaneous and brutal. The white marble floor of the Grand Mosque was pristine one moment. The next, it was slick with the bright red of arterial blood. The swords of the heretics rose and fell with a rhythmic, mechanical brutality. They struck down old men whose foreheads were pressed to the ground in prayer. They butchered women who were weeping in spiritual ecstasy near the walls. The white robes of the pilgrims soaked up the blood like thirsty sponges. The screams of the dying drowned out the recitation of the Quran. Chaos reigned supreme in the courtyard of the Almighty. The attackers showed no mercy and hesitated for nothing. They trampled over the bodies of the fallen to reach fresh victims. The holiness of the location meant nothing to these invaders. In fact, the sanctity of the place only fueled their murderous rage. They believed they were cleansing the earth of superstition. Every life they took was an act of their twisted devotion. The massacre was not a battle between armies but a harvest of unarmed souls. Pilgrims ran in circles, trapped within the walls of the mosque. There was nowhere to run, for the gates were blocked by horsemen. The scent of musk and rosewater was replaced by the copper smell of death. It was a violation so profound that the mind struggled to comprehend it. The house of God had become a slaughterhouse in the span of an hour. The sun continued to shine indifferently on the carnage below. The Carmatians laughed as they waded through the gore of the faithful. They were proving a terrible point with every stroke of their blades. They wanted to show that no lightning would strike them down. They wanted to prove that the sanctuary offered no protection against steel. The massacre continued for hours without a single moment of respite for the weary. The sacred earth of the sanctuary had absorbed only tears of repentance for centuries. Now it was forced to drink a deluge of human blood that it could not swallow. The white marble turned into a slick, red skating rink of gore. The drainage channels of the mosque were overwhelmed by the viscosity of the fluid. Abu Tahir al-Janabi sat high upon his warhorse in the center of the courtyard. He watched the extermination of 30,000 unarmed souls with a cold detachment. He did not look like a general in the heat of battle. He looked like a bored judge presiding over a mass execution. He drank in the screams of the dying with a terrifying sense of satisfaction. His eyes scanned the heaps of the fallen without a single flicker of pity. The swords of his men eventually began to dull from the sheer volume of bone. The mountains of corpses grew so high they blocked the paths of their horses. The sheer mass of dead flesh became a logistical problem for the killers. Abu Tahir looked around the devastated courtyard and made a decision that shook the heavens. He raised a hand and issued a command that would stain history forever. He pointed his sword toward the holy well of Zamzam near the Kaaba. This was the miraculous spring that had saved the son of Abraham from thirst. It was the source of living water that pilgrims drank for healing. But the Carmatian leader saw it only as a convenient garbage pit. His soldiers began to drag the limp and broken bodies across the slippery stones. They heaved the dead pilgrims over the stone lip of the ancient well. The sound of splashing water was quickly replaced by the dull thud of flesh. One by one, the bodies plummeted into the darkness of the narrow shaft. The crystal-clear water was instantly polluted by the seepage of dark blood. The well filled up with a speed that defied all belief. It was packed to the very brim with the rotting limbs of the faithful. The source of life was suffocated under the crushing weight of the dead. The spring that was meant to quench thirst became a stoppered, festering grave. A foul and heavy stench began to rise from the mouth of the spring. The holiest water on earth was transformed into a poisonous soup of decay. Abu Tahir watched this ultimate desecration with a satisfied smirk on his face. He had turned the symbol of divine mercy into a symbol of absolute cruelty. He wanted to show that the water held no power to save the righteous. The well was now a tomb for those who had come seeking purification. The horror of the act silenced even the wind that blew through the valley. It was a statement that in this new era, nothing was sacred. The smell of the blocked well would haunt the city for generations to come. When the heavy silence of death finally settled over the desecrated sanctuary, it felt heavier than the heat. The screams of the dying had faded into the stillness of the afternoon. Abu Tahir al-Janabi urged his warhorse forward across the corpse-strewn courtyard. The animal stepped gingerly over the mounds of the dead to reach the center. The leader rode directly toward the Kaaba, the black cube at the heart of the world. This was the focal point to which millions turned their faces 5 times a day. It was the axis around which the spiritual life of the faithful revolved. He looked upon the house of God not with fear but with a sneer of contempt. He stopped his mount in the shadow of the great structure and looked up. He did not dismount or bow his head in the presence of the divine. Instead, he shouted a challenge that echoed off the surrounding mountains. He mocked the ancient stories of protection mentioned in the Holy Book. He asked loudly where the flocks of Babel birds were hiding today. These were the birds that had once destroyed an army of elephants with stones of baked clay. He demanded to know why the sky remained empty and blue above his head. He challenged the Almighty to strike him down where he sat in his saddle. But the heavens remained silent and indifferent to his blasphemy. No lightning bolt split the sky to incinerate the heretic leader. No ground opened up to swallow his horse into the abyss of the earth. The only answer he received was the buzzing of flies and the hot wind. The silence of the universe seemed to validate his monstrous ego. Abu Tahir took this silence as absolute proof of his own supreme power. He believed he had defeated the superstitious fears of the masses. He turned his gaze to the kiswa, the heavy black cloth covering the Kaaba. It was embroidered with verses of the Quran in shimmering gold thread. It was the veil of the sanctuary, sacred and untouched by common hands. He barked a command to his soldiers to strip the shrine naked. Men scrambled up the sides of the structure like looting rats. They dug their knives into the heavy fabric and began to slash. The sound of the tearing cloth was loud in the silent square. It sounded like the ripping of a giant sail in a violent storm. The cloth tumbled down in heavy heaps onto the bloody stones below. The soldiers fell upon it with the greed of common thieves. They fought over the gold threads and tore the sacred text apart. They ripped the verses of unity into ragged scraps for souvenirs. The Kaaba stood exposed in the harsh light of the naked sun. It looked shockingly small and grey without its majestic covering. It was revealed to be just a cube of rough stone and mortar. The survivors watching from the shadows felt their hearts break in their chests. They saw the nakedness of the shrine as a final, crushing humiliation. The mystery had been stripped away by dirty hands and sharp knives. The illusion of inviolability was shattered on the floor of the mosque. Abu Tahir laughed as he watched his men trample their holy verses. He had proved that in his world, steel was stronger than prayer. The culmination of the sacrilege arrived not with a whimper, but with the heavy, rhythmic thud of iron boots on marble. Abu Tahir al-Janabi dismounted from his warhorse at the very foot of the exposed and naked structure. He handed the reins to a subordinate and gripped the haft of a massive mace. The weapon was a heavy bludgeon of black iron designed to crush helmets and skulls. He walked with a terrifying, deliberate slowness toward the eastern corner of the Kaaba. This was the sacred niche that housed the Hajar al-Aswad, the black stone. Tradition held that this object had fallen from the gardens of paradise at the dawn of time. It was believed to have been white as milk before absorbing the sins of mankind. For centuries, the lips of prophets and caliphs had touched its smooth surface in reverence. It was the physical point of contact between the celestial and the terrestrial realms. Now, it faced the cold, unblinking malice of a man who wanted to break the sky. The Carmatian leader stood before the relic and looked at it with deep disdain. He did not see a holy object sent by the Creator to guide the faithful. He saw only a rock that men worshipped instead of their own potential. He raised the heavy mace high above his head, his muscles bunching with exertion. The sun glinted off the dark metal for a split second before it descended. He brought the weapon down with a violence that sought to murder the stone. The sound of the impact was a sickening, dry crack that echoed across the valley. It sounded less like a hammer hitting a rock and more like a bone snapping. The meteor, which had survived for millennia, shattered under the blow of the barbarian. It fractured into several jagged pieces, dislodged from the silver casing that held it. A collective gasp of absolute horror rose from the few survivors hiding in the shadows. They fully expected the universe to recoil from this supreme act of violence. They waited for the earth to split open and swallow the aggressor whole. But the physics of the world remained cruelly consistent and indifferent to the blasphemy. The stone broke just as any other stone would break under the force of iron. Abu Tahir did not stop with the destruction of the smooth surface. He dropped the mace and dug his fingers into the recess of the wall. He wrenched the broken shards of the black stone from their ancient setting. He held the fragments of paradise in his hands which were still stained with pilgrim blood. He turned to his men and laughed, a sound that was devoid of any sanity. He shouted a proclamation that froze the souls of those who heard it. He declared that if God wanted to protect his house, he would have done so. He screamed that the true Kaaba was not a pile of rocks but he himself. He announced the end of the Sharia and the abolition of all religious law. He proclaimed the beginning of a new era where there was no sin and no forbidden act. He told his followers that they were free from the tyranny of prayer and fasting. With a casual disrespect, he tossed the holy fragments into dirty leather sacks. His soldiers cheered as they loaded the broken heart of Islam onto their camels. They treated the most sacred object on earth like common loot stolen from a market. The army turned their backs on the ruined sanctuary and began their march home. They left behind a city that was broken in spirit and drowning in silence. The eastern corner of the house of God was now just a gaping, empty socket. It stared out at the carnage like an eye that had been gouged out. The spiritual center of the world had been hollowed out by the hands of a madman. The stolen fragments of the black stone were carried across the burning sands to Bahrain. They traveled hundreds of miles to the oasis of Al-Hasr, the Carmatian stronghold. This was the fortress capital of the heretics, a place where religious law did not exist. Here, the relic awaited a fate that was infinitely worse than simple destruction. It faced a systematic and public humiliation designed to break the spirit of the faithful. Abu Tahir did not lock the stone away in a golden vault like a treasure. He did not treat it as a prize of war to be admired from a distance. He wanted to prove that the object possessed no inherent power or divine sanctity. For 22 long years, the fragments of paradise were subjected to absolute filth. The stone that had been kissed by the Prophet was now treated as common refuse. Dark legends began to circulate through the markets of the horrified Muslim world. Whispers claimed the leader had embedded the holy stone in the floor of a latrine. Others said it was used as a footstool for him to rest his muddy boots. Every day, the Carmatians demonstrated their total contempt for the divine order. They invited the world to watch as they defiled the holiest object on earth. They waited for a punishment from the heavens that simply refused to come. The psychological impact of this theft was a wound that would not heal. The pilgrimage to Mecca, their Hajj, ground to a complete and devastating halt. The faithful could not bear the thought of circling a Kaaba that was broken. There was no point in traveling across the world to kiss an empty void. The corner of the house of God stood jagged and bare like a missing tooth. It was a constant, physical reminder of the impotence of the caliphs in Baghdad. The Abbasid rulers offered vast sums of gold for the return of the stone. They begged and pleaded with the terrorists who held their religion hostage. But Abu Tahir laughed at their desperate offers and rejected their bribes. He enjoyed the anguish of the empire more than he desired their wealth. The silence of the empty Kaaba was a heavy weight on the soul of Islam. A generation grew up knowing that the heart of their faith was held captive. They prayed toward a sanctuary that had been violated and stripped of its dignity. The Karmatians built their own false shrine in Bahrain to mock the original. But no pilgrims came to their plastic Mecca, only soldiers and slaves. The world remained in a state of suspended spiritual animation for 2 decades. People watched the skies, wondering why the Almighty allowed such evil to persist. The theologians had no answer for the triumph of the heretics in Bahrain. It seemed that the forces of chaos had defeated the forces of order. The stone, which was meant to wash away sins, was now covered in them. The connection between heaven and earth had been severed by a madman's hammer. The faithful were left to wander in a spiritual desert without a compass. They learned the hard way that history does not always favor the righteous. Sometimes, the villain wins, and the holy places are left to gather dust. The empty corner of the Kaaba screamed a silent message of vulnerability. It proved that nothing in the material world is safe from the hand of man. It was only after the slow and agonizing death of Abu Tahir that the nightmare began to lift. The warlord did not meet his end in the glory of battle. He was not struck down by a bolt of lightning from an angry god. He died rotting in his own bed, devoured by a pox that ate his flesh. His body turned into a cage of sores and gangrene before his heart finally stopped. With the monster gone, the fanaticism of the Karmatians began to wane. They looked at the stone not as a trophy of war, but as a bargaining chip. Greed replaced ideology in the minds of his successors. The Abbasid Caliphate, desperate to heal the wound, offered a king's ransom. They emptied the treasury to buy back the soul of the faithful. A massive sum of gold dinars was paid to the heretics of Bahrain. The return of the relic was as unceremonious as its theft. The stone was not carried back in a golden palanquin or a jeweled chest. It was wrapped in a rough, dirty burlap sack like common grain. It was thrown into the Friday Mosque of Kufr with a casual disrespect. A letter was attached to the bundle with a terrifying message. It read, "By command we took it, and by command we have returned it." The people of Kufr rushed forward with trembling hands to open the sack. They wept with joy to see the stone, but their tears soon turned to shock. The object was no longer the smooth, singular hole they remembered. The hammer of the tyrant had done irreversible damage. The black stone had been smashed into 7 distinct, jagged fragments. It was a broken mosaic of what it once was. The violence of the iron mace had left deep, permanent scars. It looked like a wounded soldier returning from a hopeless war. The caretakers of the Kaaba had to call upon the finest silversmiths. They needed to perform a desperate surgery to hold the relic together. A heavy frame of silver was crafted to bind the 7 pieces. Rivets were driven in to keep the heart of Islam from falling apart. When it was finally placed back in the eastern corner, the circle was complete. The Hajj could resume, and the faithful could once again kiss the stone. But the atmosphere in the holy city had shifted forever. The pilgrims who circled the Kaaba now did so with a shadow in their eyes. They touched the cold silver frame and felt the cracks in the rock. They realized with a chilling clarity that the sanctuary was not invulnerable. They understood that God had allowed His own house to be desecrated. The stone had been used as a footstool and worse for 22 years. It had been defiled by the filth of men and the heavens had remained silent. This knowledge planted a seed of cold fear in the collective heart of the believers. They looked at the cracks and saw the fragility of their own world. The scar on the stone was a reminder of the capacity for human evil. It proved that nothing in the material realm is safe from destruction. The Kaaba stood tall again, but the innocence of the faithful was buried in the well.